I'm ready. Ready as I'll ever be. Can I get another week?
No.
Oh.
Vaughn, are we ready? Yeah, I'm ready. Excellent. When you ready, you do you. All right. Well, thank everyone who was able to turn out on this rescheduled colloquium day. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jerred Jolin. He received his PhD in 2018 from the Joint Doctoral Program in Special Education between the University of California, Berkeley and San Francisco State University. He came to EOU in 2019, and he is currently an associate professor in the College of Education and the coordinator of the Special Education Initial Teacher Licensure and Special Education Endorsement Programs. His research interests are in the areas of item response modeling, educational measurement, and assignment design. His work, he wants you to know, has been rejected by more journals than it has been published in, but he is proud to say that his presentation today is based on a paper that he and his colleague from the Stanford Graduate School of Education managed to convince the Journal of Applied Measurement into accepting for publication. When Jerred is not toiling away in his office, he enjoys living life with his wife Robin, daughter Monty, son James, and the furriest member of the Jolin family, a corgi named Daisy Tater-Tot Jolin. And apparently Daisy has other names she goes by. She's sometimes known as Corgathy Charlemagne, and sometimes as Corgathal James Simpson. Take it away.
Yeah, I gave that dog those names just to mess with my kids. Okay, well thank you, Steve, for the introduction. And so in this presentation, I'm just going to be discussing the use of an exploratory item response modeling approach to develop this teacher continuing professional development progress variable. I'll talk about the approach in general. I'll talk about how the approach was applied in the context of this project. And then throughout, I'm just going to kind of tout some of the benefits of using an item response modeling approach to analyzing survey data relative to more kind of traditional approaches to analyzing survey data, which fall under the general heading of the classical test theory framework. So if any of you have big survey data, we need to talk. We can make some things happen. Talk a bit about the motivation for this project. I collected this survey data for the Oregon Trail Regional Educator Network, and so RENs are collaborative initiatives that were developed by the Educator Advancement Council. There are 10 of them throughout the state of Oregon, and their goal is to provide like regionally specific continuing professional development for the teachers that they serve. And so you'll see that the Oregon Trail REN serves these 4 counties. So their goal here is a new one compared to when I did this project. When I did this project, they wanted to survey their teachers and find out that 80% of them reported having engaged in meaningful continuing professional development opportunities provided that the OT REN provided. And so I suggested, well, okay, why don't we try to get a baseline of what they're already doing? There's a lot of teachers out there in these 4 counties that you're serving. Let's try to get a handle on what's happening and what isn't happening, and maybe that information will be useful for you all when you are thinking about, coming up or offering kind of new types of continuing professional development activities. That's kind of the motivation of this work. Now I want to get into just some clarification of terms. So if you're familiar with assessment or educational measurement, you've probably heard of the concept of a construct, right? A theoretical concept that we don't observe, we can't see it, but we infer its presence based off of somebody's performance on a test. Intelligence is like the seminal example. We can't see intelligence, but if I give you the IQ test, I can estimate what your level of intelligence is. Motivation. teacher efficacy, reading comprehension. These are other examples of skills that we infer their presence based on a student's or an individual's performance on some kind of measure. I'm contrasting that with a progress variable. A progress variable is something much more generic. It has nothing to do with like a theoretical concept. This is just simply a variable that we can use to measure growth and development by using some kind of tool to locate a person somewhere along the continuum of that progress variable. And so these two things like are not mutually exclusive, right? So a progress variable, such as the one that I'm going to talk about, that is developed based on survey data that was collected based on teachers' self-reported frequencies of engagement in continuing professional development activities, could actually be used to infer a teacher's degree of professional efficacy, which would be like an example of a construct. So they're not completely different, but I just make sure to do differentiate, because I'm not like really measuring teacher intelligence or knowledge. As you'll see, this data is self-report data, and I simply ask students to report how frequently they engage in a variety of CPD activities, continuing professional development. So there's a slight difference there. And over here on the right, I just have an example of like an oversimplified reading comprehension construct. Right, constructs that, well, I'll talk more about a construct in the next slide, so I don't want to get ahead of myself. So now let me talk a bit about how I did this. So what you're seeing here, you'll recall that I'm using an exploratory approach. What you're seeing here is what is referred to as a confirmatory approach. And this is referred to as the Bear assessment system. And this is the approach to measurement and assessment that I was trained in at Berkeley. We start with a construct map. That's the first stage in developing an assessment. It's a visual representation or a conceptual model that describes how students progress or develop within some area of skill or proficiency. Basically, it organizes student understanding and abilities into hierarchical levels. So, thinking back here, right? As we move up those levels, students are becoming more kind of proficient in their ability to comprehend what they're reading. So normally you would start with the construct map. Based on that theory, you would develop a test, some items, and you would say, okay, I'm developing items that are specifically going to target different levels of my construct. Sometimes I'm going to have items in which it's possible for students to demonstrate knowledge at all the levels of the construct. It all depends on what it is that you're trying to measure. You develop those items, you create an outcome space, which is essentially the rubric. How do I score student responses to be indicative of the levels of my construct? We analyze that data. It produces what is referred to as a right map. More on that later. And then what we do is we compare our empirical findings, the locations of those items on that right map, relative to what we predicted with the construct map. And so this is an iterative approach. We might go back through this cycle over and over again until we're pretty happy that our assess is giving us valid and reliable measurements of like student proficiency at these different levels of the construct. I used an exploratory approach. And what that means is you see that I've severed that first line. I did not develop an assessment to measure a construct in the way that I described it. I found an assessment that was already out there in the research literature that was developed by some researchers in the Netherlands, made some adjustments to it, and started there. Administered the assessment, collected the data, scored it, analyzed it, and then used that data to develop a construct on the quote-unquote back end. And so this is sometimes referred to as a bottom-up approach. Masters and Forster in the 90s wrote about this particular approach. They talked about analyzing student work products, so like giving students a mathematics test, analyzing their work, and then using patterns in their responses to propose like stages of development in their ability to do that mathematics. So this is the exploratory approach, because I wasn't trying to prove a hypothesis about the structure of my continuing professional development construct, because I didn't start out with one. So why continuing professional development? You have up here one of the Oregon administrative rulings from the Teacher Standards and Practices Commission. These are just the regulations that govern teacher and licensure and govern educator preparation programs. They set professional standards for teachers. And so as you see here, TSVC requires that teachers undergo continuing professional development. And this is a condition for renewing their teaching licenses. Now, teachers are also motivated just to improve in their practice for intrinsic reasons. It's not all coming from, the TSPC. Some teachers might just be interested in learning new strategies to better support their students. Some teachers might want to increase their skill sets because they're looking to get promoted or take on new jobs. And there's also been a lot of research into the role that continuing professional development plays in teacher change, right? Because that's why we do this. We want teachers to learn these new skills so they change their practices for better reasons, to improve student outcomes, to improve school outcomes. And so at least what the paper that I was really kind of drawn to was written by Clark and Hollingsworth in 2002, and they proposed that teacher change is enabled by a change environment. And that change environment consists of 4 different domains, right? There's the personal domain. This is the teacher's beliefs, knowledge, attitudes. There's the external domain, external sources of information, i.e. CPD, continuing professional development. We have the domain of practice, which is essentially professional experimentation. And then we have the domain of outcomes. To what extent, or the domain of consequence, to what extent were our student outcomes met? So the theory here is that a teacher has their skill set, they go to a professional development opportunity, they learn a new skill or strategy, they bring that back to their classroom and they experiment with it, and then based on how well it works, they either adopt it or they don't adopt it. So kind of our goal with this project is to give the Oregon Trail Wren some information that we thought would be useful for them to better target a wider range of continuing professional development activities for their teachers, all toward the end of making or producing more expert teachers and better educated students. And so there, again, there's a lot of research literature that discusses kind of frameworks of continuing professional development activities. We use this one. And so this is from a paper by De Vries et al. I already referred to them. They're the researchers in the Netherlands whose survey we use with their permission. So they propose this scheme in which continuing professional development activities are categorized based on the nature of the activity and then the goals that the activity has. And so we like this one just because it acknowledges that there are a wide array of continuing professional development activities, that CPD is multifaceted. It's not just learning new things. It entails reflection. It entails collaboration with your colleagues and peers. And also, we thought it would be useful to be able to kind of categorize these different types of CPD activities using this particular scheme, because then when we looked at our data, we could make some decisions about, okay, well, what are the categories of these CPD activities that the teachers who are supported by Oregon Trail Wren are doing less, and which ones are they doing more? And maybe that would be useful information for the Regional Educator Network. So the first category are updating activities. They focus on expanding teachers' knowledge, keeping them informed about new developments in their subject areas, pedagogy, educational technology, learning new things basically. Secondly, we have reflective activities in which teachers are encouraged to critically evaluate their teaching practices, identify areas for improvement, develop a deeper understanding of their instructional methods, etc. And then lastly, collaborative activities designed to foster a sense of community among teachers, encouraging them to work together, to share knowledge, to support each other, to work together to solve problems. So these are like the 3 broad umbrellas under which we kind of developed our, well, we didn't develop it, that De Vries developed their survey. Okay, last bit of literature review. Well, we're working with rural teachers, so I was just interested in, well, what does the literature out there have to say about rural teacher continuing professional development? There's not a whole lot of recent research out there. One paper that's over 20 years old suggested that in a comparative study, the rural teachers in that sample engaged in less CPD than teachers who were working in urban areas. They highlighted barriers, factors that contributed to these differences, things like geographic isolation, limited resources, funding, staff shortages. And then, of course, they suggested that, well, inequality in CPD opportunities can lead to educational inequities for students. They can lead to inequities in teacher knowledge, student outcomes, and overall school quality. So one solution is to get a good understanding of, well, what are our teachers doing in this rural part of the state? And knowing that, how can we make sure that we are providing them with a broad range of opportunities to continue to develop their skills? And I think that's one kind of interesting future implication for research that I won't talk about now, but that I may remember when I get further into my presentation. Okay, so we've laid some groundwork. Now let's talk about methods. So I surveyed 220 teachers who were working in districts supported by Oregon Trail Ren. You see that they worked in a sample of 15 school districts. That's about 68% of the school districts that Oregon Trail Ren supports. We see that the majority of the teachers are white females with more than 15 years of teaching experience. I wasn't able to get data on like demographic data on the teachers, the full population of teachers who were working in those districts at this time. But I did do some digging, and there was a recent article published by Oregon Public Broadcasting in 2025 that suggested that, like, according to recent statistics, about 14% of teachers in Oregon report as being culturally and linguistically diverse. So that would leave about 86% of the teachers being white or other. So we're kind of roughly comparable there. We have about 73% being white. And some older data suggested that about 73% of teachers in Oregon are females. So we have like some evidence of comparability, but I'm not trying to say that these findings are meeting like the strict criterion for generalizability. But there is some correspondence, so I wanted to make sure to talk about that. And then here's the survey. 37 questions. 10 updating activities, 13 reflective activities, 14 collaborative activities. So you've got some examples of those items there. I read about educational reforms and promising practices, an updating activity. I write new curricula with colleagues, a collaborative activity. Another thing that I'll acknowledge is you'll see the full set of items later when I talk about some of the findings, is that many of these items could map on to like multiple of these domains. Like some of the ones that DeVries and his colleagues indicated as being like reflective activities, you could actually make an argument for those being collaborative as well. And so that's certainly another opportunity for doing some more kind of secondary analyses of this data. But I'm just kind of going with what they propose in their paper. And this is how they rated their engagement in each of these CPD activities. Never doing it at one end, doing it more than once a week at the other end. And this was a change that we made from the original scale. DeVries and his colleagues use a 4-point scale ranging from never, rarely, regularly, and very often. I wanted my data to be more in terms of like temporal frequencies with which teachers might do these things. Now again, this is not a perfect scale. We asked for feedback on the scale in this survey, and I'll talk about some of that later in my presentation. But it was a good enough start for this pilot study. Okay, Steve, there are your numbers. So this is the model. So I used an item response model. And so that is an item level model. It gives us a lot of very useful diagnostic information about test items at the level of the item, as opposed to information at the level of a test. I'm not going to go over that equation, but I do just want to call your attention to a few of the key parameters that are useful to understand. This model produces a person parameter, and that's symbolized up there with the theta. The person parameter is simply the individual's level of ability on the test that you're testing them with. Okay? Higher theta estimates means that the person is more skilled in the area that you're testing. Lower theta estimates means that the person is less skilled. In my context, where I'm asking teachers to self-report their engagement in CPD activities, a higher theta estimate would be associated with a teacher who was more likely to report engaging in more of the CPD activities at higher frequencies, if that makes sense. Someone who is lower is a teacher who is more likely to report engaging in these things with less frequency. Now, this model also gives you an overall item difficulty parameter, okay? This is just the level of difficulty of the item. And both the theta, the person parameter, and the item parameter are on the same measurement scale, which is the really cool thing about this model. And I'm going to show you what that looks like in a few slides. And it's a logit scale. So this is a probabilistic model. We're talking in terms of probabilities. We're not in the world of regression where we're talking about deterministic models. Since I'm using a partial credit scale, right, like for each item there are 5 score categories, in addition to that overall item difficulty parameter, I get a difficulty parameter for each of the steps. And a step is simply a transition from one category to the next. So if I have 4 score categories, I have 4 step parameters. The difficulty from going from 0 to 1, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4. And then lastly, it provides us with what are referred to as Thurstonian thresholds, which are really the cool thing that we get from this model. But I'm going to wait to talk about those in a few slides. Another really cool thing about this model is that it does not assume equal distances between score categories across different items, right? In most conventional analyses of survey data, we have somebody, rate their frequency of engagement in these CPD activities, and then we just add up those numbers. Oh, a 0 here, a 5 here, a 4 here, a 1 here, a 2 here, a 3 here. We add them up, and there's our measure. In so doing, we're making a few untenable assumptions, and I want to talk about what those are. And so the take home here is that this model does not make that assumption. And again, I'll show you examples of what that looks like here in a minute. So I want you to just consider these 2 items, okay? Item 10, an updating item. I attend conferences and meetings pertaining to my subject matter hosted by professional associations. And item 11, a reflective item. After class, I reflect on my lessons. So consider how a teacher might interpret the distance between these response options in the context of this item versus this item. Right? A 1-point increase from never to once a semester in conference attendance likely represents a substantially different magnitude of change in behavior than that same 1-point increase in reporting that I never reflect after class or reflect on my lessons after class versus doing that once a quarter in a semester. So the point being is that when we just use that sum score approach, we're just assuming that the psychological distance, that the amount of kind of CPT engagement that is required to move from score category to score category within these 2 items is the same. And it's very hard to make that argument. And this is a very common kind of shortcoming to survey research that you see in the field of psychology and educational research. Right? The amount of effort, the time, the resources that it takes to attend a conference once a semester is far on a wholly different scale than the amount of time and resources that it takes to reflect on one's lessons after class. Okay, I've given you a bit of the background on kind of the motivation. We've talked about the model. I've given you some insight into like one of the benefits of using this particular approach. One caveat that I'll make is that this is a very kind of complicated estimation procedure, so it does require a lot of data. You can't fit that kind of model to a data set that has like 20 respondents in it, especially if you have items with 5 categories, right? You need a lot of response counts within those categories in order to kind of estimate these parameters accurately. So let's look at some of the results. And the first result that I want to look at is measurement precision, right? When we have a survey, we should always be concerned with how accurately are we measuring proficiency of the people whom we are assessing using that instrument. Now you'll see here a curved line with data points and then just a straight line, okay? The curved line represents this particular model's approach to estimating measurement precision. And the take home here is that it does not assume the same amount of measurement error across the ability distribution as does a classical test theory approach. When we're just assuming that like we can just add these numbers up and that those sum scores are our measures, and then we use those measures in like parametric tests, things like ANOVAs and t-tests. We're assuming that the amount of measurement error is consistent across the ability distribution, which again is not a very tenable assumption. If I have a very hard test and I give that test to students who are very lowly skilled in that area, I'm not going to get a lot of good useful information from that test because the test is well beyond their ability. And the same is true on the other end. If I have a very easy test and I give it to a group of students who are very skilled in this area, well, I'm not going to get a lot of information because it's simply going to be too easy for them. They're going to get all the answers right. But what this partial credit model does is that it provides us with kind of ability-specific measurement precision. So what you see here is that along the x-axis, this is that theta. This is that person parameter. With my test, I had less accurate measurements for teachers who had lower theta estimates. And that's indicated by the fact that the line curves up, going higher up the y-axis, which is the measurement error. Starting at 0 and then going to the right, you'll see that the trend is simply that the measurement error, the standard error measurement, starts to decrease. So we get some very useful information. Like if I wanted my test to be sensitive to variation at like the lower end of my respondent kind of my respondent sample, well, I didn't really do a good enough job because I have more kind of variance on that end of the distribution. Regarding reliability of the survey, in Roche modeling, we use what is referred to as person separation reliability. And this basically tells us how well a test can distinguish between different levels of the person distribution, the theta distribution. It's interpreted in the same way as like Cronbach's alpha is. It's a value between -1 and 1. So we see here a very high coefficient, 0.9. So we're happy with the reliability. I wanted to talk briefly about like validity evidence based on the instrument content. So you recall that I did not develop this on my own. I didn't have time to do that. I found one in the literature that had already been validated in Europe, but using, they did things like submitted it for review by school principals and expert teachers. I had my stakeholders at Oregon Trail Ren also review the survey. We changed the wording to some of the items. We removed some of the items because they simply weren't relevant for their teachers, added a few items. I still have connections, with the Bear Center at Berkeley, with my advisor, so consulted with him. So we did make some effort to kind of make that survey more specific to our population. So another thing that we look at here when we're using an item response modeling approach is validity evidence based on the internal structure of the variable. Now, one way to provide evidence of that is in the context of that confirmatory approach that I talked about earlier today. Like when you hypothesize your construct, and I think, here's what a student looks like when they can't do it. At the top is what an expert student can do. And then here are 3 or 4 levels in between that I think are like useful waypoints on their way from no proficiency to full proficiency. But when we start with that and then we develop our tests, we can actually look at how well our items bore that out. I didn't do that. So what I'm showing you here is a right map, okay? You'll recall that in this type of analysis, the person, the theta, the person estimates are on the same scale as the item difficulties. So what you're seeing here is the distribution of respondents as x's, and then these are the items, with the items marked out by their item threshold. So what we see here is that for the whole range of the respondent distribution, we have items. So we are getting information about all of our students. You'll notice that I have some of these item thresholds are well above the highest performing individual. And then we have one outlier here, which it probably would have made sense to drop because I don't know what's going on with this individual, being that they are so far below kind of the bulk of the distribution. So this just tells us that we have good measurement coverage. We don't have any like serious ceiling or floor effects. So in the context of like academic achievement testing, right, the information that I could glean from this is that, well, maybe I can reduce some of these, I can eliminate some of these items, okay? If I know that like, this sample of individuals is like the target sample that I developed this test for, we'll have a lot of stuff up there that's maybe simply too difficult. So I can maybe remove those items. I can reduce the length of the test. And oftentimes you can do that and not reduce the reliability of the test. What's like another strength of this particular approach? Now, again, I'm going to tell you about thresholds here in a minute. I want to talk about evidence for validity based on response processes. So we weren't comprehensive in the activities that we included in our survey. We asked teachers to tell us, were there any professional development activities that you do that weren't on this survey? And they provide us with some examples of those. About 10% of the respondents didn't like the scale that we used. That never to more than once a week. They wanted labels that were broader for some of the categories. Like, for example, monthly instead of once a month. Others suggested completely new rating scales when needed, as appropriate, when I have difficulties annually. And so certainly if we were going to use this survey again, we would want to really think hard about like, how are we going to improve that scale? Because in reality, it's not appropriate for some of the items. Like, think about going to conferences. No teacher goes to a conference more than once a week, or once a week, or once a month, or even once a semester. They're probably going to conferences annually, or once every other year or something. So we didn't have that option for them. So that angered some of the teachers who completed this survey. Okay. Let's get complicated here. So this is the right map that I showed you, right? So this right map it's basically the raw form of the right map that you get from the data analysis package that I use. We were interested in developing this profile. We wanted to develop this baseline of engagement in CPD activities, okay? So we did that using the thresholds. So you'll see here that for each item, there's a blue rectangle, a green rectangle, a yellow one, and a red one. So these mark the thresholds within the items. These are transition points across the measurement scale within each item. So for example, the first threshold, this is the point on the Logit scale where scoring in level 1, 2, 3, or 4, so engaging in the CPD activity at any frequency whatsoever becomes more likely than never doing it, okay? Threshold 2, the green rectangles. That's the point at which levels 2, 3, and 4 together become more likely than levels 0 and 1 together. So these are cumulative probabilities. But we're only focusing on the blue rectangles, because this is the threshold that's distinguishing between respondents who have participated in a CPD activity at all versus those who have not done it at all. Steve?
Sorry, just a quick question about this. So the columns here are individual.
Yeah, sorry.
Columns here are individual.
Yeah, these are the items.
And so you've sorted them.
And based on an ascending order of their first thresholds.
Okay.
So you notice as you go left to right, the blue rectangles go
Got it.
up the scale.
Yep.
Thanks for that clarification.
Thank you.
And so we see some interesting things. Well, sorry, let me take a step back. So we saw these gaps. Is there a laser pointer here or something? I guess not. You notice this gap right here, right, where there's a separation between the blues, and then there's another gap here. Jordan. So we use those as like our cut points, right? So now we have these 3 clusters of items. So each cluster includes a unique set of CPD activities. The ones in cluster 1, well, these are the CPD activities that our teachers had a higher likelihood of reporting doing at any frequency versus not doing. These were the easy things for the teachers to report doing. You notice that by the elevated level of the blue rectangles here, relative to those in this first cluster, this was the second most difficult to report engaging in set of CPD activities. And then the same is true for the third cluster. So more on the implications of that later. And we have about a quarter of a standard deviation separating kind of the 2 items that are at the kind of the points of separation for this first and second cluster, and about 3/4 of a standard deviation here. So not huge differences, but interesting differences nonetheless. So now I want to take a step back, and I want to talk about some of the diagnostic kind of cool things about this model. So we're going to consider a tale of 2 items here. Recall a few slides back when I showed you the ruler. I had the item that was about reflecting on lessons after class, and then the item that was about going to conferences. Same ones are here. So what we see here are these 2 items perform very differently based on this analysis. Right? So this is showing us empirical evidence of the fact that when we just assume that like it takes the same amount of like CPD engagement to move across score categories with an item, this is proving that that's wrong, right? We see here that for this item, it's very easy for the majority of the sample to report that they very frequently report reflecting on their lessons after class. That's not true for the conference item, right? That 4th threshold is at the very top. So this kind of information is useful depending on the kind of test that we're developing. Let's consider this in the context of academic achievement. If I wanted a test that was very sensitive to low performers, students who were not very skilled like in the area that I'm testing, a lot of these kind of lower performing items would be ideal because I'm getting at the abilities of those students who are lower in this distribution. On the contrary, if I wanted items that were better at like spanning, like I wanted to get more information about the range of abilities of the entire distribution of my students, I would want items that were more spread out like that. And again, this item is also illustrating the problem with this scale for some of the items, right? You'll recall that category 4 was I engage in this CPD activity more than once a week. Well, no one goes to a conference more than once a week, which explains why that fourth threshold is so far up there relative to the distribution. We also get some interesting information about informational redundancy. So here are two updating items, items 3 and item 4, which if you follow these rectangles up, you see that the thresholds are kind of roughly staggered. They're kind of right in the same positions. And you look at the items. I read professional journals. I read scientific literature. Okay. If I was interested in refining this test, I would think very critically about whether or not I need both of those items, because they're essentially providing me with the same type of information. So if I wanted to reduce the length of my test, I could consider eliminating one of those. So just a few examples of how this particular approach to survey data analysis can be used kind of diagnostically to improve surveys. Okay, start moving along here. So these are the cluster 1 activities. Okay, now I want to talk about some of the interesting kind of themes that emerged. You'll recall that these are the easiest to engage in CPD activities. One thing that I notice is that a lot of these easier to engage in activities are things that can kind of be done informally as part of regular school routines. Like they don't require a lot of extensive additional time or resources to do, right? So this provides pretty convincing evidence for why those items were so much further down on the scale compared to some of the other ones. So we see after class reflecting on lessons, talking to colleagues about what I think is important in education, sharing teaching ideas. These are just things that good teachers just kind of do throughout the day. They don't require a lot of planning. Here we have that middle category, cluster 2. There's a fewer number of them, but we still see that we have kind of a range of updating, reflective, and collaborative activities. Now these require kind of more thoughtful organization, time management, and strategic planning, right? They're not as easy simply to just kind of build into your everyday classroom practice as some of those examples from that first cluster were, right? Some of these require formal events, so things like attending conferences. They require, professional reading, so staying current with educational materials, understanding educational reforms, examining research. So again, these are things that require kind of more effort on the part of teachers to engage in. But nonetheless, they're important kind of skills and they're important strategies for teachers to be engaging in order to continue to develop professionally. And then lastly, cluster 3. Reading through some of these, now they require much more significant time investment and coordination. Constructing materials and writing curriculum with colleagues, right? This requires scheduling and the time to do that. Co-teaching, team teaching, preparing lessons with teachers. These are things that are harder to do. Some of these, they involve being vulnerable, opening like kind of your practice up to your colleagues. So watching your colleagues teach, having yourself be observed teaching, but videotaping yourself teaching and then analyzing your performance, using student evaluation data to improve your instruction. And then some of these really require a lot of professional knowledge. So being able to read scientific literature and professional journals. They require some technical skills, so things like constructing digital materials, conducting video analysis. So just kind of intuitively, it seems to make sense that we found kind of this particular kind of clustering of items kind of falling in this order, just based off of kind of what we know about like how busy teachers are throughout the day. Okay. We're getting close to the end here. And so here's what we did. I talked earlier about a continuing professional development engagement progress variable, okay? So here we have the progress variable. I'm not expecting you to read that. I'm just going to walk you through how we developed that thing. So you recall that previously I had my vertical lines separating the columns of clusters. Well, now I'm going horizontally. And again, I'm placing my cut points based on separations and the locations of these kind of first thresholds. And then we're just qualitatively analyzing the frequency of engagement of the particular types of continuing professional development activities within each of the rows. So for example, let's look at level 1, low engagement. Right? We see that there are no thresholds beyond just those first thresholds there. Right? At this level, there's low engagement in reflective activities, infrequently studying student work products, not using student performance data to improve instruction, not reflecting on lessons after class. Teachers at this level are seldom discussing challenging teaching experiences with others or thoroughly analyzing problems before selecting solutions. So these are like the entry-level students who aren't really doing a lot in terms of continuing professional development. And then, of course, as we move up the levels, the frequency of engagement and then the variety of activities that they're engaging in becomes consistently greater. And interestingly, the majority of the sample is at this level 3, the high engagement level, which is doing a lot. I mean, if you were to take time to read that level 3 definition, this seems to provide some like counter evidence to suggestions that teachers in rural communities aren't getting a lot of opportunities to engage in continuing professional development. To really understand that, we would want to give this survey to a sample of teachers, working on the west side of the state, and to maybe the same group of teachers being supported by Oregon Trail Ren to really look at those differences. But I thought this was like, encouraging evidence for Oregon Trail Ren. You guys are doing a lot. Okay, so what does it all mean? What does this matter? Well, I think one useful potential application of this progress variable is to inform next steps. Like, what would we do next for a teacher, okay? Based on where they're at, especially if they're kind of low, at a lower level of this progress variable. So let's say we had a student at level 1, right, that low engagement level, but we wanted them to get up to level 3, that high engagement, where they're doing a lot of, well, a good variety of engagement in different continuing professional development activities. Well, one difference between these two levels is that at level 3, teachers are engaging in more reflection. So for a teacher at level 1, we would want to, work with them to establish a daily or weekly reflective practice. We would want to set them up with the ability to analyze student work products to understand how effective their instruction is, to make changes to their instruction based off of that data. We would want to encourage them to engage in more peer discussions with their colleagues about challenging teaching experiences and working with colleagues to solve problems in the classroom. We would want to help them develop kind of more thorough habits of problem solving. We would want them to increase the amount of student feedback that they're soliciting from their students through kind of both informal discussions and more formal data collection procedures. We would also want them to be more active in peer review meetings. We would want them to be requesting observations of their lessons from peers. We would want them to be observing like their more expert peers' lessons. And again, these judgments are just based off of the differences in the frequency of engagement on that map and then the number of activities that were present there. So this could be just a good way to kind of help a student, a teacher, kind of improve in their practice. Another really cool thing is that I think it provides a logical sequence for the provision of a continuing professional development program. Right? The ordering from cluster 1 to cluster 3, it suggests kind of a natural progression in professional development that might inform how a CPD program could be structured. Right? You'll recall that the sequence basically moves from activities that teachers find more accessible in their everyday practice to those that require kind of greater amounts of time investment and vulnerability. So I think that would, it's another very realistic kind of applied application, hence the Journal of Applied Measurement, right? We're trying to use kind of these complex measurement results to make kind of applied decisions that might impact, in this case, teacher performance. Okay, let's talk limitations, and then there's some time for questions. Again, I already touched on this. I don't know how representative my data was of the population of teachers who were being supported by Oregon Trail Ren at the time that I collected this data. There does seem to be some overlap with the demographics of teachers throughout the state of Oregon, but we don't know for sure. I have no idea what my response rate was. I don't know how many total teachers they were supporting, and I don't know how many of those teachers completed my survey. So that's, generally it's the ones who are very happy with what's happening or the ones who are very angry with what's happening, who take the time to fill out these surveys. I talked about the issues on the labels on that scale. Certainly if we were going to do this again, we would want to kind of go back to the drawing board in terms of how we were going to provide those kind of response options for the different CPD activities. And then perhaps the greatest limitation is that this is self-report data. Okay. Are teachers even telling the truth? I mean, I think we have some good evidence that, like I mentioned, like intuitively and logically, it seems to make sense how those kind of items kind of ordered across those clusters. But we don't know for sure whether or not those teachers are being truthful in how they were responding to those questions. Okay. So there you go. There you got Corgathal James Simpson right there. And now I will only answer questions about Santa.
Are there any questions about corgis, Santa, or the actual talk?
I have a couple questions before I ask my question. When did you collect the data?
2 years ago.
Okay. I'm curious, I was curious about that because this fall, all of the RENs put together this recruitment and retention over time report, which included all the demographics of the districts that they serve. Yeah.
Oh, nice.
So that might be interesting to look at to do some comparisons with your research to see if anything matched up at all.
Yeah, I reached out to McKenna McDonald. Like she wasn't able to give me any information. But
well, there's a report posted on the EOU website, and also with that is the Oregon Equity Report that comes out every 2 years that has demographics per districts, but you'd have to know who you were serving.
Right.
And the reason I'm curious about this is you didn't collect any information about years of teaching, anything that they.
We had years.
You had years of teaching.
Years of
experience.
Years of experience in education. Yeah.
Because I'm curious if there could be any correlations made between the levels of engagement and the years of teaching.
Right.
And the reason I ask that is because in my biased opinion, and I have no evidence to back it up, I think as we're producing more teachers, some of our less experienced teachers actually may participate in more reflective practices than folks who may have been in the business a while.
Right, those individuals who think that they have it down. They've grown, they've peaked, they're doing it optimally. The more experienced teachers.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm just out of curiosity. I'm curious how that all aligns, but I know you don't have that, but maybe an opportunity for future studies.
So another source of validity when you're trying to validate an assessment is to explore relationships with other variables. So we actually did perform a regression where we regressed years of teaching experience on like the CPD engagement, trying to get at that question. And like our hypothesis was that teachers who had higher levels, well, we didn't have a hypothesis. We just wanted to see what would happen. And as it turns out, it was not a statistically significant finding, but it was a negative coefficient, which does suggest that the teachers who were higher, who had more years of teaching experience, were actually lower in kind of their reports of engagement. So some anecdotal stuff. I didn't include it in this presentation. just because I didn't think it was too compelling, but maybe it would be an additional.
That's the kind of stuff I
so-
understand. I didn't really understand the blocks, and I needed some opera glasses for the stats.
Yeah,
but
it's a lot happening.
thanks.
Well, you'll
Jerry.
get to read the paper
Can't
when
wait.
it comes out, and then you'll.
Other questions?
Thanks, Jerred.
Oh, you're welcome,
Yeah.
Sean.
And given the overall age of and years of experience and that skewed distribution, it would be really tough to get at that question with his data set. I have a different question, though. So you've got these 3 different categories,
Yes.
and trying to use that in a way, or at least thinking about using that in a way to sort of structure how to improve teaching. but yet
Professional development.
professional, yeah, but
Yeah.
but is there any indication, do you have good data showing that the continuing education that seems to be harder to reach is doing any better than the things that are easier to do? So maybe you don't
Yeah.
need to move them up.
Yeah, I mean, I think, engaging in more of those collaborative practices where you're being observed and you're observing other teachers and you're meeting about kind of what you're seeing in those observations and kind of collaboratively working together to improve areas where maybe improvement is needed. I think those are powerful professional development opportunities. They're different than going to a conference. They're different than me going through my set of student quizzes and doing some error pattern analysis. So
Yeah,
Yeah,
definitely different. But what I want to know, is it better?
right,
I'm just curious about, like, I get what you're doing and I think it's really cool
yeah.
and it intuitively makes sense, but
Right. But you want to know
does it bear out?
if these ones, all these collaborative activities are like these hardest to do ones. Like, does it even matter?
Right.
Like, are they better than the ones that are in this first cluster? Yeah, I'd have to look into that research. That's not something that I investigated. This paper was more just about like this exploratory approach, and then making some kind of general applied practicable applications of the findings. But that's a good idea, Sean. Thank you.
So I've got a question that might be a little bit related to that, but
Okay.
a preliminary question to that. Is it critical for your model that the time scale be the same for every single question?
It is.
It is critical for
It
the
is
model?
critical because if I have, let's say I stick with 4 categories.
Yep.
Or 5 categories. And for 20 of my items, I have the labels that I used. And then for 10 items, I have a completely different label. Well, now the meaning is different between those. It's really difficult to make comparisons between them because teachers will have interpreted. It invites a different interpretational lens on the scale.
That's true, but shouldn't some items require a different interpretational lens? This sort of relates to Sean's question because, for instance, one of the items that's definitely going to be in that 3rd category of yours
Yeah.
is conference attendance,
Right.
right? Because it's hard to do frequently.
Yeah,
Right.
it's unrealistic. It's not just hard.
Exactly.
It's unrealistic.
But anything like that is naturally going to wind up in your 3rd category.
Good point. Yeah, so it could be that I need additional categories to account for those activities that occur. That they occur so infrequently does not mean that it's a bad thing. Attending a conference once a year is great. Like, that's not like a concern.
But I guess my question is, why is it critical that every item have the same temporal scale when certain items, like reflecting on your day's lessons, are things that can be done very routinely,
Yeah.
and other items like going to conferences are things that can't?
Right.
I mean, shouldn't the scale of an item reflect the reality of how likely somebody could do that?
Yeah, and it could be that there are more advanced models that can account for that. Like, I can tell the model that for these items, I have a different scale. And so that could account for variance that is unique just by virtue of having a different set of rating scale categories on those items. So I mean, it's possible to maybe model that mathematically and to account for it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Jerred. I guess
Yep.
I was noticing in here too. I wonder if there's, as you're thinking about redesigning the scale and sending this out, can you go back to the questions or the activities in cluster 1, cluster 2, cluster 3?
This one?
That'll work. And then that earlier one showed this too. I see a relationship between the types of activities reported, like in cluster 1,
Yeah.
that are described as easy to do, and cluster 3, which are described as hard to do. There's also an increasing verifiability. So I'm wondering if there's a reporting bias that's showing up here, whether it's anonymous or not anonymous.
Okay.
You might be sitting there with report wondering, is my supervisor going to see this?
Oh, yeah.
Well, if I report cluster 3 activity of any sort, what I see in all of those is the word colleagues, some external verifiable piece in that
Okay.
activity. And that decreases, I can't read them all, but they're the ones I can read. I guess what I'm getting at is here's some of this clustering
Yeah.
may also be related to reporting bias. In the
So,
same way
so they are reporting doing it more than they actually do.
well, no, more along the lines of like, do I reflect on my lessons every day? Yep.
Right.
Anybody say I didn't? But if I say, oh, I collaborate with my colleagues on teaching lessons. Well, now I look around the room a little bit. You know what I'm saying is if some of these activities, even as I report,
Yeah.
may end up being expressed in the outcome of this model.
Okay.
I don't know how strong or how weak that effect may be, but as you look ahead, I would wonder if there isn't a way in these non-parametric models to assess error against that specific reporting bias. You might do it through survey design of like, these are completely anonymous, make sure people know that, but still, it's going to be on
Right.
people's minds. I would wonder more if the phrasing of these activities and a slight change in those
Yeah.
might help remove that. It's just, when I look at them, I see a real relationship between the clusters
Mm-hmm.
and how verifiable those activities might be external to my own,
Wait, so just so I'm understanding you, you're suggesting that for some of these items that are not externally verifiable, that maybe some teachers are reporting doing them more often than they're not? Is that what you're suggesting?
or just that, just they're easier to click yes, to select yes, and on other ones,
Right. They're not really thinking about it.
right,
Yeah.
because who can say I'm not?
Yeah.
So
No,
of course
that's,
I
I mean, that's
am.
that's the challenge with using self-report data.
Yeah.
I mean, it's an imperfect.
But to focus on that would be, I guess what I'm thinking is to look at how these activities are phrased
Okay.
as maybe a way to select out if there's bias there, and I know it is, but I see that relationship in these clusters,
Mm-hmm.
and it may just be the way that they're phrased
Okay.
on there.
Yeah. No, that's good. I mean, it's an imperfect survey. This is. For the next one, yeah. If it's ever going to get used again. Yeah.
Additional questions for our speaker? All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.